I remember the way the lamplight fell across Owen's hands that night, casting shadows that made his fingers look longer, more delicate than I'd ever noticed before. We were sitting in my living room, the way we had countless times over the years, but something felt different. The air was thick with autumn humidity, and the old house seemed to hold its breath around us. The whiskey bottle sat between us on the coffee table, nearly half empty. We'd been drinking slowly, methodically, the way men do when they're trying to fill silence without admitting there's something to fill. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune from the kitchen, and somewhere upstairs, the floorboards creaked with the settling weight of a house that had seen too many quiet evenings like this one. Owen had been fidgeting with his glass for the better part of an hour, rolling the rim between his thumb and forefinger in a way that made me want to reach across and still his hands. I'd known him since we were 12, had watched him through awkward teenage years, his wedding day, the birth of his children, 1,000 ordinary moments that had woven themselves into the fabric of my adult life. He was my constant, the one person I never questioned would be there. But that night, he seemed fragile in a way that made my chest tighten. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I almost missed it. He said he'd been thinking about something for a while, something he couldn't shake. I waited, watching the way the amber liquid caught the light as he turned his glass in endless, nervous circles. Then he looked up at me, and I saw something raw in his eyes that I'd never seen before. He said he'd always wondered what it would be like to kiss a guy. Not as a joke, he was quick to add, not like the stupid dares we used to make as kids. Just to know what it felt like. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to take back. My first instinct was to laugh, and I did, but it came out brittle and wrong. I told him he was drunk, that we both were, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. We'd had more to drink on other nights without crossing into territory like this. Owen didn't laugh. He didn't look away. He just kept watching me with those steady brown eyes, and I realized with a jolt that made my hands shake that he wasn't joking at all. Something shifted in that moment, like a tectonic plate moving deep beneath the surface of everything I thought I knew. The room felt smaller suddenly, the familiar spaces between us charged with a kind of electricity that made my skin prickle. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence that followed, loud enough that I was certain Owen could hear it too. I wanted to say something to break the tension, to return us to safer ground, but my throat felt dry despite the whiskey. Instead, I found myself looking at Owen as if seeing him for the first time. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead. The small scar above his left eyebrow from when we'd crashed our bikes racing down Miller's Hill when we were 14. The curve of his mouth as he waited for me to respond. And somewhere deep in my chest, in a place I'd kept carefully locked for as long as I could remember, something began to stir. Something I'd buried under layers of routine and expectation and the comfortable fiction that I was exactly who I appeared to be. Owen's confession hadn't just fractured the evening. It had cracked open a door I'd spent years pretending didn't exist. The morning after that conversation with Owen, I woke to sunlight filtering through the beige curtains of my bedroom, casting everything in the same muted tones that had defined my life for years. My house reflected who I thought I was supposed to be. Practical hardwood floors, walls painted in safe grays and whites, furniture chosen for function rather than beauty. Nothing bold, nothing that would draw attention or raise questions. I was 36, a high school English teacher at Riverside High, where I'd worked for 8 years. My classroom was in the East Wing, overlooking the parking lot where teenagers gathered each morning with their backpacks and complicated dramas. I knew their patterns by heart now, could predict which students would struggle with Gatsby, and which would surprise me with insights about Holden Caulfield that made me remember why I'd chosen this profession in the first place. My days followed a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing. Coffee at 6:30, always black. The same route to work, past the Methodist church with its white steeple and the corner store where Mrs. Chin always waved from behind the register. Hallways that smelled of floor wax and teenage anxieties, the sound of locker doors slamming, the comfortable weight of lesson plans and red ink pens in my jacket pockets. Vanessa often said she envied the predictability of my schedule. She worked in marketing at a firm downtown, her days filled with client calls and deadline pressures that left her exhausted by evening. We'd been together for 3 years, and she'd begun dropping hints about engagement rings and starter homes in the newer developments on the other side of town. Places with better school districts, she'd say, running her fingers along my arm as we watched television. Her enthusiasm for our future felt like a weight I couldn't quite carry. When she talked about children, about the kind of father I would be, something inside me grew quiet and distant. I told myself it was natural, that men were supposed to feel nervous about these things. But sitting across from her at dinner, watching her animated face as she described the wedding venues her sister had recommended, I felt like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. Owen's life had taken a different path entirely. He'd married Sarah right out of high school, before either of them had really figured out who they were. Their house was always full of noise, his daughter Emma's piano practice, his son Jake's video games, the constant hum of family life that seemed both chaotic and enviable from the outside. Owen worked construction, his hands permanently stained with sawdust and calluses, his truck filled with tools and empty coffee cups. Despite the differences in our daily routines, we'd never drifted apart the way childhood friends often do. Every Thursday, we met at Murphy's bar for drinks and conversation that felt effortless in a way that nothing else in my life did. With Owen, I didn't have to perform or pretend. I could talk about books he'd never read, and he could complain about difficult clients without either of us feeling judged. But even with Owen, there were parts of myself I kept carefully hidden. I'd learned years ago to let my gaze slide past certain faces in coffee shops. The man with dark eyes who read poetry collections while drinking his morning espresso, the college student with paint-stained fingers who always sat by the window. I trained myself not to linger, not to wonder, not to acknowledge the small flutter of recognition that sometimes stirred in my chest when I noticed the curve of a jaw or the way someone's laugh carried across a crowded room. In my bedroom closet, behind winter coats I rarely wore, there was a shoebox filled with photographs from college. Pictures of me with friends whose names Vanessa had never heard, from parties and late-night conversations that belonged to a version of myself I'd quietly retired. There was one photo in particular, me and my roommate David, sitting close together on his dorm room bed, both of us laughing at something I could no longer remember. David's hand was resting on my knee, casual and natural, and looking at that picture now, I could still feel the warmth of that touch, the way it had made me feel both terrified and alive. I'd told myself for years that those feelings were just confusion, the normal experimentation of young men finding their way. But David had graduated and moved to California, and I'd chosen the safer path. Teaching, Vanessa, the life that made sense on paper. Most evenings, after Vanessa had gone home to her own apartment, I would sit in my living room grading papers until late into the night. The house would grow quiet around me, filled only with the scratch of my pen and the occasional creak of settling wood. In those moments, when the rest of the world felt far away, I sometimes let myself think about the roads I hadn't taken, the conversations I'd never had, the person I might have become if I'd been braver. The night Owen asked his question, all those carefully buried thoughts had rushed back to the surface like water breaking through a dam. His words had reached into that hidden part of me and pulled it into the light, trembling and exposed. As I stood in my kitchen that morning, watching steam rise from my coffee cup, I realized that everything I'd built, this house, this routine, this carefully constructed version of myself, felt suddenly fragile, as if Owen's simple confession had revealed just how much of my life was built on foundation I'd never bothered to examine. In the days that followed, Owen and I pretended that conversation had never happened. When we saw each other at Murphy's the following Thursday, we talked about the weather, about his latest construction project, about anything that felt safe and familiar. He made a joke about getting too drunk on whiskey, and I laughed along. Both of us performing normalcy with the careful precision of actors who knew their lines by heart. But something had shifted between us, subtle as a change in barometric pressure before a storm. Owen's eyes lingered on mine a fraction longer than usual. When he passed me the ketchup bottle, his fingers brushed against mine, and neither of us pulled away immediately. These moments were so brief, so easily dismissed as coincidence, that I might have convinced myself I was imagining them if not for the way my pulse quickened each time. The question he'd asked hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire we'd tried to stamp out but hadn't quite extinguished. I found myself replaying his words during my morning commute, while standing in front of my classroom teaching The Great Gatsby, while lying in bed next to Vanessa as she slept peacefully beside me. His voice, quiet and uncertain, admitting he'd always wondered what it would be like to kiss a guy. I told myself he was going through some kind of midlife crisis, that his confession was nothing more than curiosity born from too much alcohol and too many years of routine. But late at night, when the house was quiet and my defenses were down, I couldn't shake the memory of how his eyes had looked when he said it. There had been no joking in them, no casual experimentation. There had been longing, real and raw and carefully hidden until that moment. 3 weeks after that night, Owen called me on a Saturday morning. His voice sounded different over the phone, more hesitant than usual. He asked if I wanted to come over and help him install new shelving in his garage. Sarah was taking the kids to her mother's for the weekend, he said, and he could use an extra pair of hands. I should have made an excuse. Should have said I had plans with Vanessa, or papers to grade, or any of the dozen small lies we tell to avoid situations that feel dangerous. Instead, I heard myself saying yes, that I'd be over after lunch. Owen's house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees that had begun their autumn turn, leaves shifting from green to gold in the October light. I'd been there hundreds of times over the years, for birthday parties and barbecues, for lazy Sunday afternoons watching football. But walking up his driveway that day, I felt like I was approaching foreign territory. The garage smelled of sawdust and motor oil, familiar scents that usually put me at ease. Owen had already laid out the materials, pine boards, brackets, a level, tools arranged with the methodical care he brought to all his projects. We worked in comfortable silence for the first hour, measuring and marking, falling into the rhythm of shared labor that had defined so many of our weekends over the years. But as the afternoon wore on, I became increasingly aware of Owen's presence in ways that felt both foreign and oddly familiar. The way he concentrated when using the drill, his tongue caught between his teeth. The sound of his breathing when we lifted the heavy shelving unit into place. The warmth radiating from his body when we stood close together, checking measurements. As evening approached, we sat on his back porch with cold beers, admiring our work. The garage looked organized now, purposeful, everything in its proper place. Owen seemed pleased with what we'd accomplished, but there was something else in his expression, something that reminded me of that night in my living room. The sun was setting behind the trees in his backyard, casting long shadows across the grass where his children usually played. The neighborhood was quiet, most families inside preparing dinner or settling in for the evening. In that peaceful stillness, Owen turned to me and spoke the words that would change everything. He said he'd been thinking about what he'd told me that night, that he couldn't stop thinking about it, actually. His voice was steadier now, more certain than it had been with whiskey loosening his tongue. He said he'd never felt like he could ask anyone else, that I was the only person in the world he trusted enough to be honest with. Then he asked if I would help him figure it out. The question was different this time, more specific, weighted with weeks of consideration. It wasn't just about wondering anymore. It was about knowing, about crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed once we stepped over it. I looked at Owen's face in the fading light, at the man who had been my constant companion through adolescence and adulthood, who had been best man at his own wedding while I stood in the audience watching him promise forever to someone else. I saw the vulnerability in his expression, the courage it had taken to ask again after we'd both pretended that first conversation had never happened. And I realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that this wasn't just Owen's question at all. It was mine. It had always been mine. The words I'd been holding back for weeks, maybe for years, finally found their way to the surface. I told him yes, that I would help him figure it out, that maybe I needed to figure it out too. After that evening on Owen's back porch, everything between us changed in ways both subtle and profound. We began finding excuses to spend more time together, though we never called them excuses aloud. Owen would text me about small projects around his house that required an extra pair of hands. I would invite him over to help me winterize my garden or move furniture I could have easily managed alone. Our Thursday nights at Murphy's stretched longer, conversations wandering into territory we'd never explored before. Owen began talking about his marriage in ways that surprised me with their honesty. He told me how he'd proposed to Sarah not because he'd felt ready, but because everyone expected it of them. They'd been high school sweethearts, the golden couple that teachers and parents pointed to as an example of young love done right. He said he'd never once stopped to consider what else might be possible, that the path from dating to engagement to marriage to children had felt as inevitable as gravity. It wasn't that he didn't love Sarah, he explained, but that he'd never asked himself what love was supposed to feel like, whether the comfortable partnership they'd built was the same thing as the passion he read about in books or saw in movies. I found myself sharing things I'd never spoken aloud to anyone. I told him about the disconnect I felt with Vanessa, how her excitement about our future made me feel like I was drowning in expectations I couldn't meet. I described the way conversations about marriage and children left me feeling hollow, as if she was talking to a version of me that existed only in her imagination. Owen listened with an attention that felt different from anything I'd experienced before. With Vanessa, I often felt like she was waiting for her turn to speak, already formulating responses before I'd finished my thoughts. But Owen absorbed my words completely, asked questions that went deeper, seemed genuinely curious about the parts of myself I'd kept hidden even from people who claimed to know me well. These conversations happened in unexpected moments. While we painted his kitchen on a Saturday afternoon, the radio playing quietly in the background. During long walks through the state park on crisp October evenings, our breath visible in the cooling air. In his truck, parked outside the hardware store, neither of us ready to end whatever we'd been discussing. I began to realize that Owen saw me in ways I'd never allowed myself to be seen. He noticed when I grew quiet during our talks about the future, when my responses became too careful and rehearsed. He called me out gently when I deflected with humor or changed the subject to safer ground. Under his patient attention, parts of myself that I'd kept locked away for years began to surface. The shift from emotional to physical intimacy happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Owen started sitting closer to me when we watched games at his house, our shoulders touching on his couch. When we worked on projects together, he found reasons to brush against my hand, to steady me with a touch to my back or shoulder. These moments felt both accidental and deliberate, carrying an electricity that made my skin hum with awareness. I found myself studying Owen in ways I'd never allowed myself to before. The way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck when he needed a haircut. The small constellation of freckles across his forearms from years of outdoor work. The shape of his mouth when he concentrated. The way his hands moved with practiced confidence whether he was using tools or simply gesturing while he spoke. The first time we kissed, it happened so naturally that it felt like the inevitable conclusion to weeks of careful circling around each other. We were on his back porch again, on a Thursday night when Sarah had taken the kids to her sister's house. We'd been talking about a book I'd recommended, something about second chances and roads not taken, when Owen grew quiet and turned to face me fully. The kiss was brief, tentative, barely more than a brushing of lips before we both pulled back. But in that moment of contact, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, like a door that had been locked for decades suddenly swinging open. My hands were trembling when I reached for my beer, and I could see Owen's chest rising and falling with breaths that seemed too quick and shallow. We didn't talk about what had happened immediately. Instead, we sat in the gathering darkness, both of us understanding that we'd crossed a line from which there was no easy return. The kiss lingered in the air between us, impossible to take back, impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, I felt split between two different versions of my life. Evenings with Vanessa became exercises in performance, me playing the role of the devoted boyfriend while feeling increasingly hollow inside. She talked about holiday plans and New Year's resolutions, and I nodded and smiled while my thoughts drifted to Owen, to the way he'd looked at me in the moment before our lips touched. With Owen, everything felt vivid and alive in ways that were both exhilarating and terrifying. Every conversation carried the weight of what we'd shared. Every look held the memory of that brief, electric contact. The risk of being discovered added its own intensity to our growing connection. We were careful about when and where we met, conscious of the small town's watchful eyes and the gossip that could spread like wildfire through familiar circles. But despite the fear, I couldn't bring myself to pull back. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was living in my own skin instead of watching myself from the outside. Owen had awakened something in me that I'd spent years trying to bury, and now that it was free, I couldn't imagine putting it back in its cage. The week after our first kiss, I found myself standing in my bathroom at 3 a.m, staring at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. The face looking back at me was familiar but somehow foreign, as if I was seeing myself clearly for the first time in years. In the harsh fluorescent light, I looked older than my 36 years, worn down by the weight of pretending to be someone I'd never actually been. I thought about the boy I'd been in college, the one whose photograph was hidden in my closet. I remembered late nights in David's dorm room, studying together until the words on the page blurred from exhaustion and proximity. The way my pulse would quicken when David would fall asleep first, leaving me to watch the rise and fall of his chest in the lamplight. I told myself then that what I felt was just the intensity of close friendship, the natural affection between young men finding their way in the world. But standing there in my bathroom, I could no longer lie to myself about what those feelings had really been. The longing I'd felt watching David sleep hadn't been friendship. The ache in my chest when he graduated and moved across the country hadn't been simple loss. I'd been in love with him, desperately and completely, in a way I'd never allowed myself to acknowledge. That revelation opened floodgates I'd kept sealed for over a decade. I remembered Marcus from high school, the star of the debate team who could argue any side of any issue with passionate conviction. I joined debate not because I cared about competitive speaking, but because it gave me an excuse to spend time watching Marcus pace the classroom, his hands cutting through the air as he made his points. I remembered Jake from my first teaching job, a fellow English teacher whose laugh could make me lose track of my lesson plans, whose casual touches during faculty meetings left me distracted for hours. All these years, I'd convinced myself that these feelings were aberrations, temporary confusions that would fade if I just focused hard enough on building the right kind of life. I'd thrown myself into relationships with women who were kind and intelligent and everything I thought I should want. But even with Vanessa, even during our most intimate moments, part of me had always felt like I was performing a role rather than living my truth. The second time Owen and I kissed, it happened with deliberate intention rather than spontaneous impulse. We were in my living room, the same space where he'd first asked his question weeks earlier. This time, when he leaned toward me, we both knew what we were choosing. The kiss was longer, deeper, filled with months of unspoken longing and the grief of years we'd both lost to silence and fear. When we broke apart, Owen's forehead rested against mine, and I could feel his breath warm against my skin. He told me something I hadn't expected to hear. He said he'd carried this curiosity for years, maybe even decades, but had never found anyone he trusted enough to explore it with. His voice was quiet but steady as he admitted that watching me navigate my own questions had given him permission to examine his. It wasn't just about physical attraction, though that was undeniably part of it. It was about recognition, about seeing in each other the parts of ourselves we'd kept hidden from the rest of the world. Owen understood the weight of living behind a carefully constructed facade because he'd been doing the same thing, just in different ways. As our connection deepened, the rest of my life began to feel increasingly fragile. Vanessa started commenting on my distraction, asking if something was wrong at work or if I was feeling unwell. I found myself giving vague responses about being tired, about the stress of the school year, excuses that felt thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. My colleagues began to notice changes too. During faculty meetings, I caught Mrs. Henderson studying me with concern, and when she asked if everything was all right, I realized I'd been staring out the window for the entire discussion about semester scheduling. My teaching suffered as my attention wandered. Students who usually engaged with enthusiasm seemed to sense my distraction, and classroom discussions that should have been lively fell flat. The nights were the worst. I would lie in bed next to Vanessa, listening to her peaceful breathing while my mind raced with thoughts of Owen. I felt like I was living a double life, split between the person everyone expected me to be and the person I was finally allowing myself to become. The weight of that deception was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. But despite the turmoil, despite the fear of discovery and the guilt that gnawed at me during quiet moments, I couldn't bring myself to pull back from what Owen and I were building. For the first time in my adult life, I felt fully awake, fully present in my own existence. The revelation wasn't just that I desired Owen, though I did with an intensity that surprised me. It was that I could no longer return to the careful silence that had defined my past. I'd spent so many years constructing walls around the parts of myself that didn't fit the narrative I thought my life should follow. But Owen had shown me what it felt like to be seen completely, to have someone look at all of me and not turn away. That kind of acceptance was addictive, transformative in ways I was only beginning to understand. Reality has a way of crashing in just when you think you've found solid ground to stand on. By November, the careful balance Owen and I had maintained began to crumble under the weight of too many lies and too many stolen moments that required increasingly elaborate explanations. Sarah started asking Owen questions about his Thursday nights, about the projects that seemed to require so much of my help, about why he was coming home later and more distracted than usual. Owen tried to deflect with humor, joking about getting old and needing more time to finish simple tasks, but I could see the strain in his face when he told me about these conversations. His wife wasn't stupid, and neither of us had been as careful as we'd thought. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday evening when Vanessa showed up at my house unannounced, carrying takeout from the Italian place downtown and a bottle of wine that looked expensive. She'd been talking more frequently about our future lately, dropping hints about engagement rings and the kind of wedding she'd always imagined. That night, she seemed determined to force the conversation I'd been avoiding. She sat cross-legged on my couch, still wearing her work clothes, and asked me directly why I'd been so distant lately. Her voice carried a frustration that had been building for weeks, maybe months. She said she felt like she was dating a ghost, that even when I was physically present, some essential part of me was always somewhere else. I tried to give her the same vague reassurances I'd been offering, but she cut me off mid-sentence. She said she needed to know where we stood, that she was 34 years old and couldn't keep waiting indefinitely for me to decide whether I wanted to build a life with her. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears as she asked if there was someone else, if that was why I'd been pulling away. The question hung in the air between us, loaded with more truth than either of us was prepared for. I could have lied, should have lied, but something in Vanessa's expression told me she already knew the answer wasn't simple. Instead of responding, I looked at my hands, at the coffee table between us, at anything except the woman who deserved so much more honesty than I'd been capable of giving her. Meanwhile, Owen was facing his own reckoning at home. Sarah had started questioning his absences more directly, had noticed changes in his behavior that he couldn't explain away. One evening, she'd gone through his phone while he was in the shower, looking for evidence of whatever was pulling him away from their family. She hadn't found anything concrete. We'd been careful about our communications, but her suspicion had solidified into something harder and more dangerous. Owen told me about this during what would turn out to be one of our last conversations as we'd known them. We met at the state park, walking the trails in the growing darkness because his house no longer felt safe and mine carried too much guilt. He looked exhausted, older than his 36 years, worn down by the weight of living in two worlds simultaneously. He said Sarah had given him an ultimatum without saying it explicitly. She'd started talking about couples counseling, about taking a weekend trip together to reconnect, about all the ways they could rebuild what felt like it was slipping away. She was fighting for their marriage without understanding what she was fighting against, and that made Owen's betrayal feel even more brutal. In that moment, Walking through the bare November trees with our breath visible in the cold air, Owen made a confession that broke both our hearts. He said he couldn't abandon his family, couldn't destroy the life his children had always known, couldn't be the kind of man who walked away from his responsibilities for his own desires. But he also said he couldn't pretend that what we'd shared hadn't happened, couldn't go back to the silence that had defined his life before he'd asked that first, trembling question. I understood what he was telling me without him having to say it directly. We were caught between two impossible choices, continuing down a path that would inevitably destroy the people we cared about, or ending something that had shown us parts of ourselves we'd never known existed. The conversation I'd been dreading with Vanessa came 3 days later. She'd given me time to think about her questions, space to figure out what I wanted to say. When I asked her to sit down, when she saw the expression on my face, I think she already knew what was coming. I told her that she deserved someone who could love her completely, without reservation or distraction. I said that I'd tried to be that person, but had finally admitted to myself that I couldn't be what she needed, what she had every right to expect from a partner who'd been with her for 3 years. She asked again if there was someone else, and this time I answered as honestly as I could without destroying more lives than necessary. I told her that I'd realized things about myself that I should have understood years ago, that the problem wasn't with her, but with me, with the way I'd been trying to live a life that had never truly fit. Vanessa cried, which I'd expected, but she also got angry, which somehow felt cleaner and more honest than the sadness. She accused me of wasting her time, of letting her fall in love with someone who'd never really been there. She wasn't wrong, and I didn't try to defend myself against charges that were essentially accurate. When she left that night, taking boxes of belongings and memories we'd accumulated over 3 years together, I felt the full weight of what I'd chosen. The relief of finally telling the truth was overwhelmed by the grief of hurting someone who'd done nothing wrong except fall in love with the wrong person. The choice I'd made wasn't clean or heroic. It was messy and painful and left wreckage in its wake. But for the first time in my adult life, it was mine. The silence in my house after Vanessa left was different from any quiet I'd known before. It wasn't the comfortable solitude I'd grown accustomed to during my bachelor years, nor was it the hollow emptiness that follows an argument. This was the silence of truth finally spoken, heavy with both loss and possibility. I walked through rooms that looked exactly the same, but felt fundamentally altered. The spaces where Vanessa's belongings had been, her coffee mug in the kitchen sink, her magazines on the side table, her reading glasses on the nightstand, seemed to exhale with relief rather than emptiness. For the first time in years, my house felt like it belonged entirely to me. The weeks that followed were a study in adaptation. I learned to cook dinner for one again, to make decisions about my evenings without considering anyone else's preferences, to sleep in the center of my bed without unconsciously making room for someone who would never again share it with me. These small adjustments felt like acts of reclamation, like taking back pieces of myself I'd forgotten I'd given away. Owen and I met one final time, 3 weeks after my conversation with Vanessa. He suggested we drive to the old baseball field where we'd spent countless summer afternoons as boys, before we'd learned that the world had expectations for who we were supposed to become. The field was smaller than I remembered, the grass brown and patchy in the December cold, but sitting in his truck with the engine running for warmth, I could still see the ghosts of our younger selves running the bases with the careless joy of children who believed anything was possible. Owen looked tired in ways that went deeper than physical exhaustion. He told me he'd recommitted to his marriage, that he and Sarah were working with a counselor to rebuild what had been damaged, though she still didn't know exactly what they were rebuilding from. He said he owed it to his children to try, that whatever he'd discovered about himself would have to remain a private truth rather than a lived reality. I understood his choice, even as it broke something inside me that I hadn't known was still fragile. Owen had shown me who I really was, had given me permission to stop hiding from myself, but he couldn't follow me into the life that self-knowledge demanded. We sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching our breath fog the windows, both of us knowing this was goodbye to whatever we'd been to each other. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quiet but clear. He thanked me for helping him figure out what he'd needed to know about himself, for being the one person in the world he could trust with his questions. He said that even though he couldn't act on what he'd learned, he was grateful to finally understand the shape of his own desires. I told him that he'd given me the greatest gift possible, the courage to stop lying to myself about who I was. Whatever happened next, I would carry the memory of being seen completely and accepted without judgment. That kind of recognition changes you in ways that can't be undone. Spring came early that year, and with it came a sense of possibility I hadn't felt since I was young enough to believe I could be anyone I chose to be. Standing in my classroom one afternoon in March, watching the late sunlight slant across the desks where my students had been discussing Whitman's celebration of the self, I felt something settle into place inside me. I touched the edge of my desk, steadying myself against the solid wood as I looked out the window at the parking lot where teenagers gathered each morning with their dreams and secrets and complicated hearts. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't afraid of what they might see if they looked at me closely. The truth I'd spent so many years hiding hadn't destroyed me when I finally let it breathe. Instead, it had given me back to myself, whole and unguarded in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I didn't know what came next. There were no promises waiting, no clear path forward, no guarantees that honesty would lead to happiness. But as I stood there in the golden afternoon light, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, not because I knew what the future held, but because I finally knew who would be walking into it.